Hello and welcome back to the Crime Reel. Today we are looking at a true crime story that has always fascinated me. One that involves high society, gambling, abuse, murder, disappearance, and possible new identities. A crime which, at least in part, is deemed to be solved, but still remains one where theories and conspiracies abound. This is the story of the life of the 7th Earl of Lucan and the murder of Sandra Rivet. It is definitely an unusual one with a tragic end. Based on my research, I have my own theories on what happened following the events of the 7th of November 1974, but I would love to hear your thoughts and opinions in the comment section below. So let's look at the life of the 7th Earl of Lucan, more famously known as Lord Lucan. Richard John Bingham, who went by his middle name of John. Born on the 18th of December 1934, John was the second child of George Bingham, the 6th Earl of Lucan, and his wife, Caitlin Dawson. As the eldest son in the family, John would be the one that would inherit his father's title and would become the 7th Earl of Lucan upon his father's death. At the age of 5, John was evacuated to Wales with his sister Jane due to the outbreak of the Second World War. The following year, together with their younger siblings Sally and Hugh, John and Jane were moved to Toronto in Canada and then on to New York. For the next 5 years they lived with multi-millionairess Marcia Brady Tucker. John attended the exclusive Harvey School in New York and spent his summers at a camp in the Adirondack Mountains. Whilst in the United States, John and his siblings wanted for nothing, living a life of luxury, so when they returned to England in February 1945, they were shocked by the reality of living in wartime Britain. Rationing was still in force, their former home at Cheyne Walk had been bombed, and the family's house at 22 Eaton Square had had its windows blown out. As a teenager, John attended Eton College in Windsor, and it was here that his lifelong obsession with gambling began. He would supplement his pocket money with income from bookmaking, placing his earnings into a secret bank account, and would regularly sneak out of the school's grounds to attend horse races. He left Eton in 1953 to undertake his national service, and when stationed in Krefeld, West Germany, he became a keen poker player. John left the army in 1954, taking a job at William Brand's Sons & Co., a London-based merchant bank, on an annual salary of £500. Whilst a decent wage for the time, it was very little to a man who would often win or lose thousands of pounds at a time when gambling. John became a regular gambler and an early member of the exclusive group of rich British gamblers at the Clermont Club in Mayfair, London, which was founded by John Aspinall. Other members included the billionaire businessman James Goldsmith and Stephen Raphael, a wealthy stockbroker who was also a skilled backgammon player. These men lived a playboy lifestyle, with Stephen Raphael and John often holidaying together in the Bahamas, where they would spend their time water skiing, playing golf and gambling on backgammon and poker. John would often win at games of skill and was at one point in the world's top 10 backgammon competitors. However, he also ran up huge losses whilst gambling. On one occasion he lost £8,000, which was about 2/3 of the money that he received annually from various family trusts. On another occasion he lost £10,000 at a casino. His uncle by marriage, stockbroker John Bevan, loaned him the money to pay off that particular debt. After a colleague was promoted before him and John had just won £26,000 playing chemin de fer, he resigned from his job saying, "Why should I work in a bank when I can earn a year's money in one single night at the tables?" Following his resignation, John spent some time travelling to the US, where he played golf, raced powerboats, and drove his Aston Martin around the West Coast. On his return to England, he moved out of his parents' home in St John's Wood and into a flat in Park Crescent, and in 1963 he met the woman who would become his future wife, Veronica Duncan. Veronica lived in a flat in London with her sister Christina. Christina married the wealthy William Shand Kidd, who was the half-brother of Peter Shand Kidd, the stepfather to Diana Spencer, who would later become Diana, Princess of Wales. Through Christina's marriage, Veronica was introduced to London's high society, and it was at a golf club function in the country that Veronica and John first met. Within a few months, John had proposed to Veronica, and news of their engagement appeared in The Times and also the Daily Telegraph on the 14th of October 1963. They married the following month on the 20th of November at the Holy Trinity Church in Brompton. Whilst the ceremony was attended by Princess Alice, Countess of Athlone, few other prominent members of high society attended. The couple honeymooned in Europe, travelling first class on the Orient Express. After their marriage, John was given a marriage settlement by his father. It's a sum of money designed to finance a larger family home and any future additions to the Lucan family. However, this money was used in part to repay some of John's many creditors. The remainder was used to purchase 46 Lower Belgrave Street in Belgravia. On the 21st of January 1964, just 2 months after John and Veronica's wedding, John's father had a stroke and died. In addition to a reputed £250,000 inheritance, John also acquired his father's titles, becoming Earl of Lucan, Baron Lucan of Castlebar, Baron Bingham of Melcombe Bingham, and Baronet Bingham of Castlebar. John's wife, Veronica, became the Countess of Lucan. With this inheritance, the couple should have been set for life, but unfortunately John's gambling addiction meant otherwise. John and Veronica had 3 children together. Francis, born in October 1964, George was born 3 years later, and Camilla, who was born in June 1970. They employed a nanny, Lillian Jenkins, to help look after the children. The pair lived a lavish lifestyle and had many friends. John was recklessly extravagant. He was known for spending large amounts of money on luxury items, such as hiring a private aircraft to take his friends to the races, sourcing an Aston Martin drop-head coupe, drinking expensive Russian vodka, and racing powerboats. In September 1966, he unsuccessfully screen-tested for a part in Woman x7, but he declined a later offer from film producer Albert R. Broccoli to screen-test for the role of James Bond. With no steady job, John would often sleep late before lunching at the Clermont Club, which was generally followed by afternoon games of backgammon. Returning home to change into black tie, he would typically spend the remainder of the day at the Clermont, gambling into the early hours, watched sometimes by Veronica, who he attempted to teach about gambling. John picked up the nickname of Lucky Lucan, but as so often is the case, the public image reflects little of the reality. In truth, he was anything but lucky, with his losses easily outweighing his winnings. In 1968, his interest in thoroughbred horses alone resulted in him paying far more in race entry fees than he actually received in winnings. Despite some arguments over money, Veronica remained largely unaware of the scale of his losses and continued to live the expensive lifestyle that the couple had always enjoyed. Following the births of their second and third children, George and Camilla, Veronica suffered with postnatal depression. In 1971, John took her for treatment at a psychiatric clinic in Hampstead, but Veronica refused to be admitted. She agreed to home visits from a psychiatrist and a course of antidepressants. When Camilla, their youngest child, was 2, the family holidayed in Monte Carlo, but Veronica quickly returned to England, leaving John with their 2 elder children. As time passed, their relationship declined. With the pressure of maintaining their finances, the cost of John's gambling addiction, and Veronica's limited treatment for her postnatal depression, the relationship came to an end. In early 1973, John moved out of the family home into a small property in Eaton Row. By this point, John was no longer interested in saving his marriage to Veronica, but he did want custody of his children. He moved to a larger flat in nearby Elizabeth Street and set about trying to demonstrate that Veronica was an unfit mother. He would spy on his family and later employed private detectives to perform this task for him. John tried to get evidence that his wife had, in his word, gone mad, and visited some doctors who explained to him that she was in fact suffering from depression and anxiety. Just before John left their marital home, Veronica had sacked the children's long-term nanny, Lillian Jenkins, and a series of other nannies would take her place. John told his friends that nobody would work for Veronica. Meanwhile, Veronica confided in one of these nannies, 26-year-old Stefania Saviska, that John had hit her with a cane and had on one occasion even pushed her down the stairs. Veronica told Stefania that she feared for her safety and that she would not be surprised if John killed her one day. In March 1973, John and 2 private detectives approached Stefania when she was out with the 2 younger children. They told her that the children had been made wards of court and that Stefania must release them into John's custody, which she did. Then John collected their oldest child, Francis, from school. Veronica immediately applied to the court to have the children returned, but concerned about the case's complexity, the judge set a date for the hearing 3 months later. Veronica needed to defend herself from John's claims that she was mentally ill, so she booked herself a 4-day stay at the Priory Clinic in Roehampton. While it was acknowledged that she still required some psychiatric support, the doctors reported that there was no indication that she was mentally ill. John's whole case depended upon him proving that Veronica was unable to care for the children. Instead, at the hearing, he ended up forced to defend his own behaviour towards her. After several weeks of witnesses and arguments, John conceded the case on the advice of his lawyers. Mr. Justice Rees awarded custody to Veronica, with John being allowed to visit the children every other weekend. Their divorce continued to become ever more acrimonious. John once again began watching his wife's movements and, in addition, even started recording their telephone conversations. He would play parts of these conversations to any friends who would listen and would constantly complain that Veronica was spending money like water. Whilst John continued to pay her £40 a week, he began making her life more difficult. Knowing that part of the court agreement was that Veronica had to employ a live-in nanny, he delayed payments to the childcare agency. With no income of her own, Veronica took a part-time job in a local hospital. John befriended their nannies to try to find out any incriminating information about what was going on in the household. In September 1974, a nanny by the name of Sandra Rivet began working for Veronica. Sandra was 29 years old and, similar to Veronica, had previously received treatment for depression. At the age of 19, Sandra gave birth to a boy who was subsequently adopted by her parents. She then worked in various different jobs in the late 1960s and early 1970s before starting work at the Lucan House. By this time, John's financial position had worsened. The court case had cost him an estimated £20,000 and his gambling debts were increasing seemingly by the day. His drinking had become problematic and he had started chain smoking as well. His friends were becoming increasingly concerned about his behaviour. In drunken conversations with some of them, he spoke of murdering his wife. He was desperate for money and began asking those around him for loans to fund his gambling addiction. The financier, James Goldsmith, guaranteed a £5,000 overdraft for him, which remained unpaid. He borrowed £4,000 from his mother. His 4 bank accounts were overdrawn, and he was borrowing against his family trusts. Even though by then he was playing for much lower stakes than had previously been the case, his gambling remained completely out of control. It was estimated that between September and October 1974 alone, he ran up debts of around £50,000. Despite his ever-mounting financial problems, from late October 1974, John's demeanour suddenly seemed to change for the better. A close friend, John Wilbraham, remarked that John seemed to have finally accepted the fact that he would not have custody of his children. John met his uncle, John Bevan, on the 6th of November and seemed to be in good spirits. Later that day he met 21-year-old Charlotte Andrina Colquhoun, who said that he seemed very happy, just his usual self, and there was nothing to suggest that he was worried or depressed. It would appear that John was back to his old self. However, as is so often the case, appearances can be deceptive. At the time, casinos in England could open only between 2 p.m. and 4 a.m, so John often gambled into the early hours of the morning, starting his days around lunchtime. Unusually, on the 7th of November, he called his solicitor early in the morning. He had 2 meetings scheduled at the Clermont that afternoon, but did not arrive for either. Instead, at around 4 p.m. that day, John went into a chemist's on Lower Belgrave Street, close to Veronica's home, and asked the pharmacist there to identify a small capsule. It turned out that the capsule was Limbetrol 5, a drug used for the treatment of anxiety and depression. At around 6:30 p.m. that evening, John met with literary agent Michael Hicks Beach, as he wanted Michael's help with an article on gambling that he had been asked to write for an Oxford University magazine. John drove Michael home at about 8 p.m. that evening, but he was not in his usual Mercedes-Benz, but instead in an old, dark and scruffy Ford Corsair, which he had borrowed from a friend several weeks earlier. At 8:30 p.m, he called the Clermont to check on a reservation that he had made with Greville Howard and friends for 11 p.m. that evening. Once again, he did not arrive. Meanwhile, Sandra was busy putting the children to bed at Veronica's house. Sandra would usually have Thursday evenings off to see her boyfriend, but she had seen him the previous night, so this Thursday she was working. After putting the younger children to bed, Sandra asked Veronica if she would like a cup of tea before heading downstairs to the basement kitchen to make one. After waiting a while for Sandra to return, Veronica decided to go and see what the hold-up was. As she called for Sandra from the top of the basement stairs, Veronica was attacked. As she screamed for her life, her attacker told her to shut up, and it was at that moment that she realised that her attacker was her estranged husband. The two continued to fight. She bit his fingers, and when he threw her face down to the carpet, she managed to turn around and squeeze his testicles. This then caused him to release his grip on her throat and give up the fight. Veronica asked John where Sandra was, and whilst he avoided the question at first, he eventually admitted that he had killed her. Terrified, Veronica told him she could help him escape, but only if he remained at the house for a few days so that her visible injuries could heal. When John momentarily left Veronica's side to get a wet towel to clean her injuries, Veronica saw her chance to escape. She ran outside and went to a nearby pub, the Plumber's Arms, screamed for help, and the authorities were called. The police forced their way into Veronica's home, where they discovered Sandra's body. John had disappeared. Veronica was taken by ambulance to St George's Hospital. When Detective Chief Superintendent Roy Ranson arrived at the scene, it was noted that there was no sign of a forced entry other than where the front door had been kicked in by the first two officers who had arrived at the house. The area around the top of the basement staircase was heavily bloodstained, and a blood-stained lead pipe lay on the floor. Pictures hanging from the staircase walls were askew, and a metal banister rail was damaged. At the foot of the stairs, 2 cups and saucers lay in a pool of blood, and near this, Sandra's body was found in a canvas sack. It was noted that the light fitting at the bottom of the stairs was missing its bulb, which had been placed on a nearby chair. Blood was also found on various leaves in the back garden. John's apartment was searched and his mother interviewed. She confirmed that he had called her between 10:30 p.m. and 11 p.m. that evening and asked her to collect his children from Veronica's house due to a terrible catastrophe having occurred. He explained to his mother that he had driven past the house earlier that evening and saw Veronica fighting with a man in the basement. He had entered the property and found his wife screaming. At John's apartment, the police found a suit and shirt laid out on the bed alongside a book on Greek shipping millionaires. His wallet, car keys, money, driving licence, handkerchief and glasses were on the bedside table. His passport was found in a drawer and his blue Mercedes-Benz was parked outside. Its engine was cold and its battery flat. The Detective Chief Superintendent then visited Veronica at St George's Hospital. Although she was heavily sedated, she was able to describe what had happened to her. It was later established that John may have arrived at the home of Madeleine Floorman, the mother of one of his oldest daughter Francis's school friends, who lived in Chester Square sometime between 10 p.m. and 10:30 p.m. that evening. Madeleine was alone in the house, and as such she ignored it when someone knocked on the door so late in the evening. Shortly afterwards she received an incoherent telephone call, to which she hung up. There were bloodstains found on the doorstep that were found to be a mixture of blood groups A and B, Veronica and Sandra's blood types. At Sandra's post-mortem, it was established that she had been killed with the lead pipe that had been found at the scene, and her body had been placed into the canvas sack after she was dead. With John's whereabouts still unknown, his description was circulated to police forces across the country. Newspapers and television stations broadcast that John was wanted by the police for questioning. The police discovered that John had travelled to Uckfield in East Sussex, which was about 40 miles away, in the borrowed car. He had arrived there a few hours after the murder and spoken with his friends Ian and Susan Maxwell Scott. While there, John had written 2 letters to his brother-in-law, Bill Shand Kidd, which were posted to Bill at his London address. Ian called Bill at his country house, which was near Leighton Buzzard in Bedfordshire, to inform him about the letters. Bill immediately drove to London to collect them. After reading them and noting that they were bloodstained, he took them to DCS Ranson. The first letter read as follows: "Dear Bill, the most ghastly circumstances arose tonight, which I briefly described to my mother. When I interrupted the fight at Lower Belgrave Street and the man left, Veronica accused me of having hired him. I took her upstairs and sent Francis up to bed and tried to clean her up. She lay doggo for a bit, and when I was in the bathroom, left the house. The circumstantial evidence against me is strong, in that V will say it was all my doing. I will also lie doggo for a bit, but I am only concerned for the children. If you can manage it, I want them to live with you. Coots, trustees. St Martin's Lane, Mr Wall will handle school fees. Veronica has demonstrated her hatred for me in the past and would do anything to see me accused. For George and Francis to go through life knowing their father had stood in the dock for attempted murder would be too much. When they are old enough to understand, explain to them the dream of paranoia and look after them. Yours ever, John." And the second letter addressed John's financial matters. "There is a sale coming up at Christie's 27th of November, which will satisfy bank overdrafts. Please agree reserves with Tom Craig. Proceeds to go to Lloyd's, 6 Pall Mall, Coutts, 59 Strand, NatWest, Bloomsbury branch, who also hold an equity and law life policy. The other creditors can get lost for the time being. Signed, Lucky. The Ford Corsair which John had been driving was found 3 days after the murder in Norman Road, New Haven, about 16 miles from Uckfield. In the boot of the car was a piece of lead pipe covered in surgical tape and a full bottle of vodka. It was later established that the car had been left there some time between 5 and 8 a.m. on the morning of 8th of November. One theory was that John may have caught a ferry, either to make his escape or that he jumped from it to end his life. The owner of the Ford Corsair, Michael Stoop, also received a letter from John. This letter read, "My dear Michael, I have had a traumatic night of unbelievable coincidence. However, I won't bore you with anything or involve you, except to say that when you come across my children, which I hope you will, please tell them that you knew me and that all I cared about was them. The fact that a crooked solicitor and a rotten psychiatrist destroyed me between them will be of no importance to the children. I gave Bill Shand Kidd an account of what actually happened, but judging by my last effort in court, no one, let alone a 67-year-old judge, would believe, and I no longer care except that my children should be protected. Yours ever, John." Michael threw the envelope away before it was handed in to the police, and a search using tracker dogs was undertaken. This search uncovered the skeletal remains of a man who had disappeared years earlier, but there was no trace of John. However, it should be remembered that a complete search of the Downs was impossible, leaving open the chance that his remains were still out there somewhere. A search of the harbour also yielded nothing. Forensic examination would later conclude that the pipe found at the murder scene had blood belonging to Veronica, who was Group A, and Sandra, who was Group B. In addition, hair belonging to Veronica was found on the pipe. The pipe found in the car did not have any blood or hair on it. Whilst it was assumed that the two pipes had been cut from the same longer piece of piping, this could not be conclusively proved. The blood on the letters was understood to have been from both women. Blood was found in the car that again was believed to have been a mixture of blood from both Veronica and Sandra. In addition, hair similar to Veronica's was found inside the car. The crime became front-page news in the UK with headlines such as "Body in Sack, Countess Runs Out Screaming" and "Belgravia Murder, Earl Sought." As the investigation progressed, the relationship between John's social circle and the Metropolitan Police became increasingly strained, with some officers complaining that the Eton Mafia were working against them. Meetings attended by John's rich friends including John Aspinall, John's brother-in-law, Bill Shand Kidd, Dominic Elwes, an artist who was one of John's closest friends, and Stephen Raphael, John's stockbroker. These meetings were held at the Clermont following his disappearance. Those that were involved said that they were simply discussions between concerned friends. Dominic Elwes went to see Veronica in hospital and was reportedly deeply shocked both by her appearance and her statement. Dominic was apparently unhappy at some of the negative press coverage of the Countess, and was later ostracised by his friends for his part in an article which was critical of John that appeared in the Sunday Times magazine. Dominic ended his own life in September 1975. Susan Maxwell Scott, who was the last person to see John, was questioned about why it had taken her for so long to inform the police that John had visited her on the night of the murder. She claimed that she had not seen any newspapers or television news, or listened to any radio broadcasts that might have warned her of the importance of this visit. When John Aspinall's mother, Lady Osborne, was asked if she could provide any information that would help locate John, she replied, "The last I heard of him, he was being fed to the tigers at my son's zoo." This statement led the police to search the house and the animal cages there, In all, the police searched 14 country houses and estates, including Holcombe Hall and Warwick Castle, but once again no trace of John was found. After several adjournments, the inquest into Sandra's death began in June 1975. Various legal representatives were present, including a lawyer hired on behalf of John by his mother. 33 witnesses were called over the following few days, including Veronica, who was questioned about her relationship with John, their marriage and financial affairs, Sandra's employment and what had happened on the night of the attack. Sally Blower, who had taken a statement from Lady Frances Lucan on the 20th of November 1974, read the young girl's words to the court. Frances had heard a scream and a few minutes later had watched as her mother, who had blood on her face, and father had entered the room. Her mother had then sent her to bed. She later heard her father calling for her mother, asking where she was, and watched as he left the bathroom and walked downstairs. The landlord of the Plumber's Arms pub described how Veronica had entered his bar covered head to toe in blood before she fell into a state of shock. He claimed that she shouted, help me, I've just escaped from being murdered, and my children, he's murdered my nanny." The last person to confirm seeing John alive, Susan Maxwell Scott, told the court that he had looked dishevelled and his hair a little ruffled when she saw him. His trousers had a damp patch on the right hip. Susan said that John had told her that he was walking or passing by the Lower Belgrave Street residence when he saw Veronica being attacked by a man, so he let himself in, but slipped in a pool of blood at the bottom of the stairs. He went on to tell Susan that the attacker ran off and that Veronica was very hysterical and accused him of having hired a hitman to kill her. Once all the evidence had been presented and considered, the foreman of the jury announced their verdict. They announced that Sandra had indeed been murdered by Lord Lucan. John became the first member of the House of Lords to be named a murderer since 1760. John's family and friends were particularly critical of the inquest, which they felt offered a one-sided view of events. His mother told reporters that it did not serve any useful purpose at all. Veronica's sister, Christina, said that she felt great sadness and sorrow at the verdict. Susan Maxwell Scott continued to protest John's claims of innocence and said that she felt awfully sorry for the Countess. However, as John remained absent, his description of a traumatic night of unbelievable coincidence came only from the letters he authored and the people he spoke with soon after Sandra's murder. While his fingerprints were not found at the scene, his version of events made no provision for the lead pipe discovered in the boot of the Corsair. The claims by some that he had discussed murdering his wife, or the lack of a viable suspect for the man he claimed to have seen fighting her. No sign of a forced entry was found, and officers attempting to demonstrate that John could have seen into the basement kitchen from the street could only do so by stooping low to the pavement. The light in the basement of 46 Lower Belgrave Street was not working, making it even more difficult to see into the room. The removed light bulb was tested and found to be in working order. Furthermore, Veronica claimed not to have entered the basement that night, contradicting John's version of events. His wife's account was supported by the forensic examination made of the blood splashes and also the stains around the property. Some traces of John's blood were found in the basement, the rear garden, and on the canvas sack used to store Sandra's body. If John's version of events were true, this could have been due to contamination at the scene, but his story falls apart when it is noted that the man he claimed to have seen could not have left through the basement's front door as it was locked, and the rear door led to a walled garden through which no trace of an escape was found. Unlike his defenders, the national press were almost unanimous in their condemnation of John and did not hesitate in identifying him as Sandra's killer. Following the last confirmed sighting by Susan Maxwell Smith, John's fate remains unknown. His disappearance has captivated the public's imagination for decades. Did he die shortly after the events that night, or did he escape to a new life overseas? Many believe that John had taken his own life, including DCS Ranson, many of John's friends, and also Veronica. However, DCS Ranson later changed his view, explaining that he considered it more likely that John had not taken his own life, that a drowning at sea seemed implausible, and that it was now his belief that John had moved to southern Africa. An additional investigator, 32 years after the murder, told the Telegraph that the evidence points towards the fact that Lord Lucan left the country and lived abroad for a number of years. Susan Maxwell Scott would later tell the author John Pearson that John might have been helped out of the country by shadowy underground financiers before being judged too great a risk, killed and buried in Switzerland. Advertising executive Jeremy Scott proposed a similar theory, as he was familiar with some of the Claremont set. Over the years there have been many reported sightings all around the world that were followed up on by the police. The first reported sighting was in January 1975 when John was supposedly spotted in Melbourne, Australia. Later that year it was reported that he had been seen in Cherbourg and St Malo in France. Further sightings followed in South Africa, Mozambique, Bulawayo and India. In 1978, the police in Barbados were asked by Scotland Yard to investigate reports that a British resident was sending money to John in South America. John Miller, a bounty hunter who previously kidnapped fugitive train robber Ronnie Biggs, claimed to have captured John in 1982, but this was later exposed by the News of the World as being a hoax. John was legally declared dead on the 27th of October 1999, but no death certificate was issued, meaning that his heir, George Bingham, was refused permission to take his father's title and his seat in the House of Lords. The sightings and theories continued. In 2007, the police received reports that John had been living in a car in New Zealand, and 2 years later an investigation by the BBC suggested that John may have had plastic surgery following the murder. John's brother Hugh Bingham said in 2012 that he was sure that John had escaped to Africa after the murder. In 2016, 73-year-old Philippe Marc, a wealthy stockbroker who knew John well through their mutual love of gambling, decided that it was now time to speak his truth about the disappearance. Philippe claimed that years earlier he had been told by Stephen Raphael, who was John's stockbroker, that John had travelled to a private zoo in Kent in the early hours of the day after the murder. The zoo was owned by John Aspinall, the founder of the Claremont Club. There, John, Stephen and other friends had a discussion on what should happen next. It was inevitable that he would lose contact with his children. Veronica would get full custody, and then she would also be able to access the family trust. To prevent this happening, John would need to disappear completely. Without a body, proof of death probate would not be granted on his estate for at least 7 years, by which time his oldest child would be able to take control of his affairs. Philippe went on to claim that he was told how a pistol was offered to Lucan, who took it, went into a room on his own, and ended his life. John's body was then fed to one of Aspinall's tigers in a grotesque but entirely effective means of disposing of the corpse. In 2020, a sighting was reported in Australia. A pensioner living in suburban Brisbane was alleged to be John by Professor Hassan Ugail, a leading computer scientist. The professor claimed that state-of-the-art facial recognition technology had provided a positive ID. The man, who lived in what was described as a Buddhist commune in Brisbane's outer suburbs, was found by Sandra's son, Neil Berryman. After the murder, Veronica became addicted to prescription drugs, and her children remained in the care of her in-laws, the Shand kids. Veronica remained permanently estranged from her children. On the 26th of September 2017, At the age of 80, she ended her life believing that she had undiagnosed Parkinson's disease. In her will, she left all of her money to the charity Shelter because of her children's lack of good manners, having not spoken to them since the 1980s. George, John's son, finally became the 8th Earl of Lucan in February 2016, following some changes to legislation surrounding people who are presumed dead. Both George and his sister Camilla were not convinced that their father was responsible for Sandra's death. According to an article by writer Laura Thompson in 2024, there was a theory considered by some associates that it was Veronica who had killed Sandra and subsequently framed her husband. Such accusations were compounded by claims about Veronica's mental state and the fact that her blood, as well as Sandra's, was present at the murder scene. At the earlier inquest, a doctor testified that it was possible, albeit very unlikely, that Veronica's head injuries could have been self-inflicted. Another theory, and perhaps one of the most outlandish ones, is that both John and Sandra were murdered by actor, politician and bodybuilder Arnold Schwarzenegger. Apparently, Arnold was living in Forest Green, London at the time of John's disappearance and worked as an enforcer to raise money to fund his move to the US. This theory claims that Arnold was hired by John to kill Veronica, but when Arnold allegedly killed the wrong woman, John attempted to finish the job by killing Veronica himself. In order to cover up his mistake, it is claimed that Arnold then killed John and buried his body, leading to the decades-old mystery that we are faced with today. So what do you think happened on the 7th of November 1974? Do you think that John murdered Sandra, or was he framed by his wife Veronica? Could there have been a third party involved? And what do you believe happened to John after that fateful night? Did he die by ending his own life, either in the Newhaven Downs or the English Channel? Or did he end up being fed to a tiger at the Aspinall Zoo? Perhaps you believe that his network of wealthy friends helped him to disappear and set up a new life. Or had he become an embarrassment to his high society class and was himself murdered as a result? Maybe John simply disappeared without any help or knowledge from those around him and has remained living completely anonymously ever since. If he is still alive, John would now be 90 years old. Unless he makes himself known on his deathbed and provides some answers to these questions, or his long undiscovered remains are finally found, it seems very unlikely that we will ever have an answer to this mystery, particularly if Philip Mark was in fact correct and there was a hungry tiger involved. As always, I would love to hear your theories in the comments section below. What exactly happened to John remains a fascinating mystery, but let's not forget that this mystery began with a 29-year-old woman who lost her life in the most brutal of ways. That concludes today's case. Thank you for listening to The Crime Reel. Stay safe. Goodbye. Psst, one other fact about Lord Lucan and his family. He was the great-great-grandson of George Charles Bingham, the 3rd Earl of Lucan, who led the disastrous charge of the Light Brigade many years ago. Goodbye.